All right. Thank you for joining me in this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Martin Wilson, and we have another great show for you today. We have a debate. I have Dr. Tony Costa and Dr. Shabir Ali, and we're going to be debating about did Jesus resurrect from the grave. So I thank you for joining me. As always, I do want to encourage you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that like, make sure you hit the subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with The Gospel Truth has going on. And as always, all this content is not only on YouTube, but also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So make sure that you're following and subscribing over there, as well as I do try to keep up to date on those other platforms as well. Also, for your audio choice, I do have all this content on podcasts as well. So make sure that you are flowing over to the podcast, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. Follow, subscribe over there, do what you have to do. And while you're on the podcast, please leave a good rating so this podcast can grow. All right. That said, I do have several announcements to go over before I bring the guys in. All right, coming up Thursday, July 1st, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I have Robert Rowe and C.J. Cox going to be debating Was the Biblical Flood Global? That's coming up, so make sure you mark your calendars for that one. After that, does the mind show evidence for the existence of God? That's coming up Monday, July 5th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so be on the lookout for that one. After that, can belief in God be properly basic? David Palmer versus Aaron Fitzwater. That's coming up Friday, July 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then lastly, I have an interview. July 12th, this coming up July 12th, social justice and biblical justice. So I have Scott Allen, he's going to be joining me. So make sure you are hitting that notification bell, that like button, subscribe, so you can stay in the loop. And I posted on YouTube and on Facebook that this midway through July, I'll be taking a paternity and sabbatical, all right, break from the ministry. So I can tend to my wife, we're about to have a new child or son. So we're excited about that one. So I'll be taking a break from the ministry for that one. So yeah, this is not the final show of the year. I won't be back until September with live shows, but in the meantime, I'm going to be some of my favorite cross-examination portion of debates. I'm going to be posting those for those who may be just new subscribers and have yet to go through the whole library of what the Gospel Truth shows have what the Gospel Truth has done in the past. And some favorite just cross-examination for people who built the ministry for quite some time. So I will be posting those to keep the page up to par. With that said, I do want to bring in Dr. Tony Costa and Dr. Shabir Ali. These guys are some heavyweights, man. They've been debating for some for a long time, for a very, very long time. We just was talking before the show started. These guys have known each other for 30 years, man. I thought I was old. I thought I was senior, man. I got the salt and pepper beard going, man. But these guys, man, they've been around for a long time. But it's great to have these guys in, man. So I'm gonna bring these guys in so they can say hi to you. How you guys doing?
Good.
Doing great. Doing great.
Great. Thank you guys for joining me, man. I'm really excited for this one. I've been watching you guys for many years, for a long time, man, and I'm really appreciate everything you guys are putting forth, man. All the educational aspects, man, helping us learn about different perspectives and understandings, man. So we're excited for this one, and the audience is very excited. So before we jump into this, I'm gonna give you guys a chance to introduce yourselves to the audience. Tell them your blog, whatever you do, website, everything, man. Tell them what you do. All right. So start with Dr. Tony Costa. If you don't mind, give a quick introduction yourself.
Yes, hi. My name's Tony Costa. I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I teach at the Toronto Baptist Seminary. I also do some teaching with the University of Toronto in the areas of biblical studies and biblical archaeology. And I also teach with Providence Theological Institute in Franklin, Tennessee. I did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Toronto, and then I did my PhD in New Testament and theology at Radboud University in Holland. I'm also an ordained minister of the gospel, and I also do pastoring. And my passion is Christian apologetics and giving reasons for the Christian faith and engaging other people with different worldviews. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tony, for that introduction. All right, Dr. Shabir Ali, you're up, man. Go ahead and give a quick introduction yourself.
Yeah, I'm Shabir Ali. I live in Toronto, and Tony and I are old friends. I remember it was probably 1995 when we had our first major debate in Toronto to a packed hall of about 500 people. We were debating at that time, is Jesus the divine Son of God? And here we are today. So in the meantime, Tony and I have both moved on to earn our PhD degrees. I got mine at the University of Toronto. I specialized in Quranic exegesis, but I've always had a passion for studying the Bible. So my undergraduate work was in comparative religion. It was largely based on biblical studies. And I've continued from that time to have dialogues and debates with people from around the globe, especially with our Christian friends and Christian leaders. And I'm so excited that we're here today. I am the father of 4, and I have 3 wonderful grandsons.
All right. Thank you guys once again for coming on. And so we're going to jump into this debate. Once again, the debate is, did Jesus resurrect from the grave? And Tony, you're arguing the affirmative. Dr. Shabir Ali, you're arguing the negative. And so we're going to start with 10-minute opening statements. That's going to be followed by 5-minute rebuttals. And we're going to follow that with a 40-minute cross-examination. Both parties will get 20 minutes each to cross-examine their interlocutor. After that, we have 5-minute closings. After that 5-minute closings, we'll be taking a 5-minute break. And then we'll go into some Q&A from the audience. Also, once you have 1 minute left in your opening statements and in your rebuttals, you'll hear this chime. That'll indicate that you have 1 minute left. So just to give you a heads up. So also the time will be posted in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. So keep an eye on that as well. That's it. Tony, you're up for your opening statement. Let me know when you're ready, and I will start your time.
Okay, I'm just going to open up the PowerPoint. Just want to make sure that that is visible for all to see. Is that visible on your end?
Yes, it is. And you can go to presentation mode.
Okay, is that all right?
That is good.
Perfect. Okay, then. So I will begin my time now.
All right, you got
it. I want to take this opportunity to thank Marlon, the Gospel Truth, for having me on, and I'm also delighted to be on with my good friend Dr. Shabir Ali. Our first debate was actually 1992. I remember it well, and so I'm very glad to be on. I'm going to be arguing tonight that Jesus did rise from the dead, that he was resurrected from the grave. And I am going to be approaching this subject as a Christian theist. And what I mean by that is that I believe in the supernatural. I believe that God does intervene in human affairs and does perform various acts that we call miracles. And that would include the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So I want to make that very clear from the outset that I am a Christian theist, and also that I am a Christian who believes that the Bible is the Word of God. So from the earliest records from the Gospels themselves, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts his death and his consequent resurrection 3 times in the Gospel of Mark. And so here we read, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." It's very clear from the Gospels that Jesus not only predicted his death, but he predicted those who would bring about his death, and he also predicted the time of his resurrection. Also in the same Gospel of Mark, in the same chapter, Jesus further goes on to say, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so the idea again of Jesus coming to give his life as a ransom for many is central to the gospel message. And it is central to all of the Gospels. In fact, the Gospels have been called passion accounts with extended introductions, so that the focus of the Gospels is primarily on the last week of Jesus' life. Following the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, Jesus's early disciples would later come and they would preach on the day of Pentecost. This is the early Christian material that we find in the book of Acts, spoken by the Apostle Peter. He said, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out this that you yourselves are seeing and hearing." So from this very early preaching found in the book of Acts, the Apostle Peter tells the people of Israel that they took part in the crucifixion of Jesus, and not only the crucifixion, but that they had killed him by the hands of lawless men. But God raised him up, and the apostles declared that they are witnesses of this fact. And so the death and resurrection of Jesus, once again, was central to the earliest Christian message, even when it began in Jerusalem in the day of Pentecost. The Apostle Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and in this first letter to the Corinthians, in verses 3 to 4, Paul provides here a section that many scholars believe is an early creed. In fact, this is the earliest creed that we have in the New Testament. And Paul received this. This is not Paul's own material. He says that he passed on what he received. And this was of first importance, namely that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. And so the main points here is that Jesus Christ died for our sins, so his death was a vicarious atonement, and that he was buried, and he was raised the third day, and then he appeared. And this is precisely what we find in the gospel accounts. You find in the passion narratives, Jesus dies, he is buried, and then he is raised again the third day, and then he appears to his followers. There are 5 basic historical facts about Jesus of Nazareth that most historians are very comfortable with in talking about early Christianity. The first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion on a Roman cross, and this is considered a basic accepted fact of history by virtually all historians, whether they're atheists or Christians or non-Christians. This is one area, as the late Robert Funk, who was the founder of the Jesus Seminar, an atheist himself and a liberal, Robert Funk said that the death of Jesus is the one indisputable fact of history that we know. And so for many historians and scholars, even having a discussion on whether Jesus died or not would be considered a no-brainer. Jesus Christ died in the first century around the year 33 AD on a Roman cross. He was buried following his death. The tomb of Jesus, we are told in the Gospels, was discovered to be empty on the third day following his death by a number of his female disciples. And then after this, there were appearances of the risen Jesus to his disciples, where he appeared to them alive, and sometimes individually or in groups of disciples. At one point, we're told, Paul says, he appeared to 500 brethren at one time. And all of these four lead inevitably to the origin of the Christian way. That is to say that Christianity doesn't start with the teachings of Jesus. Christianity does not start with the birth of Jesus. Christianity started because the followers of Jesus claimed that this Jesus who was put to death was raised from the dead by God himself. And so when we consider the fact that when we look at the empty tomb, and then, of course, the appearances of the risen Jesus to his disciples, this inevitably led to belief in his resurrection. Now, it's important to note at this point that the empty tomb by itself, in and of itself, the empty tomb was not enough to convince the followers of Jesus that he was raised from the dead. But later, when he appeared to them alive and showed himself alive and showed the marks of the nails in his hands, his feet, the spear wound in his side, then they came to believe. And this is what opened the door to the Christian movement. And so the Christian movement is unique in the sense that it is the only religious movement that began with the belief that its founder was raised from the dead. And so, as Peter said in Acts 2, verse 32, which we read just previous to this, he tells us that God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. So it's important to realize that the early Christians did not seek a naturalistic explanation for the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't try to explain away his death as an apparent death or a swoon, or that the women went to the wrong tomb, or that the disciples were hallucinating that Jesus was alive again. They attributed this event to a supernatural act of God. And so they clearly say God has raised this Jesus to life, because they knew, as we know today in our modern world, that dead people generally do not rise from the dead. The death rate is still 1 per person, and dead people just don't get up and walk out of the morgue. And so the disciples of Jesus understood, we're not talking about a natural phenomena here. This is a supernatural phenomena where God himself raised Jesus to life. And notice they said, we are all witnesses of the fact. And so the New Testament documents are the earliest documents we have on Jesus of Nazareth. There is nothing earlier than the New Testament documents. And that is why all historians who study the historical Jesus, all of them invariably all go to the New Testament as the primary documents for the life of Jesus and the accounts about his death and the accounts of the empty tomb and his appearances to his disciples. And so I think it's important to understand, once again, I need to reiterate this, that if Jesus Christ died, then obviously any return from the dead would necessarily have to be a supernatural act of God. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Tony, for that opening statement. All right, Dr. Shabir Ali, you're up for your 10-minute opening. Let me know you're ready, and I'll start your time.
I'm ready.
All right, you got it for 10 minutes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters in faith, I thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak before you all. I thank Tony for sharing this platform with me. I thank Marlon for inviting me to this platform. I praise our creator and fashioner, the creator of the heavens and the earth, and I ask him to send peace and blessings upon all of his prophets, his messengers, and all of the righteous people of all time. I ask him to bless you all from around the globe who are joining us here this evening. It is evening in Toronto. Perhaps it's morning for some of you. May God bless you all. And I see this as a great opportunity for Muslims and Christians to get a better understanding of each other. Muslims and Christians have a lot in common, and our debate should not cause us to lose sight of that important fact. Both Muslims and Christians actually believe in Jesus. And when we speak about how the career of Jesus ended on the earth some 2,000 years ago, actually for both Muslims and Christians, the the point of it all, the point of our view is the point of our point of view is that we want to show that Jesus is vindicated by God. His enemies thought that they had him down, but God raised him. So the Quran says in Surah 4, verse number 158, Bal rafa'ahu Allahu ilay, but God raised him to himself. Kana Allahu azizan hakima, and God is mighty wise. So in the Christian story, Jesus resurrects from the grave, and that's the way in which God declares that he is the Son of God, according to Paul in Romans. In the Quran, and this is how God vindicates Jesus, by raising him into heaven. So in the Quran, Jesus is said to be min al-muqarrabin, one of those who are closest to God. Now, for a millennium, Muslims and Christians have debated over the question of the crucifixion and resurrection, with Christians saying he was crucified, Muslims saying he wasn't crucified. But there are two developments, or developments, I would say, in both faiths, which will help us to come to a better understanding of each other on this important question. First of all, the developments within the Islamic faith. The classical commentaries on the Quran were written more than 1,000 years ago, well, some of the most important ones, for example, Tabari, and they became the basis of subsequent traditional tafsirs, or commentaries on the Quran. The commentaries tended to copy each other, so if a mistake entered one commentary, often it was just copied into the other commentaries as well. And we should not take the fact that many commentaries in the past agreed on a certain point as the be-all and end-all. No, rather, the Quran for Muslims is the Word of God, and the commentaries are attempts by human beings to understand the Word of God. The commentaries could be wrong, but for Muslims, the Quran isn't wrong. So the Quran in Surah 4, verse 157 says, "Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu," they killed him not, nor did they crucify him, walakin shubbiha lahum, but so it was made to appear to them. The classical commentators took this to mean that somebody else was made to look like Jesus and put on the cross instead, whereas Jesus was raised up to heaven. Modern interpreters of the Quran, like myself, we feel that it is not necessary to posit that somebody else was made to look like Jesus and put on the cross. This invokes you can say an awesome miracle, and when we interpret the Quran, it's not necessary to invoke such awesome miracles. If a simpler explanation, this is called parsimony in the field of interpretation. So if there is a parsimonious interpretation, a simpler one, that is better than to invoke a great miracle of the sort of saying that somebody else was made to look like Jesus, that somebody else was crucified, and so on. So what we find more to the point is that it is possible that Jesus was, though put on the cross, not actually killed on the cross, whereas his enemies thought that they had him dead. Now, the word crucifixion can have two meanings. Meaning one, merely hanging on the cross. Meaning two, being killed by the act of hanging the person on the cross. And the Quran seems to be denying the second of the two possibilities here, meaning that even if they hung him on the cross, he did not die thereby. Now, so that's one development, making it possible for Muslims to drop the denial of the idea that Jesus was even put on the cross. Now, on the other side, there has been developments as well. Tony noted that there is nothing earlier on the life of Jesus than the New Testament documents themselves. However, scholars have been reconstructing earlier documents. For example, the document Q, which is one of the source documents for Matthew and Luke in writing their Gospels. Daniel Smith, in his two books, first, the Postmortem Vindication of Jesus and the Sayings Gospel Q, and then secondly, revisiting the Empty Tomb, the second of these two books, Tony has written a critical review of, so he's very familiar with this book and the theory. So Daniel Smith has actually looked at the Q document, and he has found that the findings of a previous scholar, Dieter Zeller, a German scholar, are basically correct in saying that the Q gospel speaks of Jesus not as dying for the sins of the world, but assumed into heaven. Now, there's a difference between a person dying, resurrecting from the dead, associating with his disciples, and then being raised up into heaven. That's the common resurrection narrative that Tony is propounding. And on the other hand, the idea that the person was assumed into heaven. Now, one of the earliest of the four Gospels is the Gospel according to Mark. And Mark chapter 16 ends at verse number 8. Others have appended other, later appendages to Mark 16 to extend it and show that Jesus appeared to his disciples here or there. But in Mark chapter 16, in the earliest, most reliable manuscripts, there is no description of a story of Jesus appearing to his disciples. There is only a promise in chapter 16, verse number 7. But here too, scholars reconstruct or try to understand what would have been the source of this Markan gospel. And they think that in the source for Mark, this verse number 7 was not there, with a promise of Jesus appearing to his disciples in Galilee. And what we remain with here is that the pre-Markan gospel spoke of the discovery of the empty tomb, but the complete disappearance of Jesus for the moment, but with an understanding that Jesus is going to come back in the future. Now, the disappearance of the man of God with a promise of his return in the future for what the scholars call an eschatological role, this whole idea is the idea of assumption. God takes up his man and preserves him for a future role. That's different from resurrection from the dead, where the person dies, he comes back to life, he's here on earth for some time, and then maybe eventually at the end he ascends, as we find in the gospel according to Luke. Now, according to Daniel Smith, these are two completely different paradigms. But the gospel writers, starting with Mark, have brought the two paradigms together to make it have both apply to Jesus. He was both assumed into heaven, and he is also resurrected from the dead. But it seems that the earlier story among Christians was that Jesus was assumed into heaven and directly from the tomb. This is also stated by Reginald Fuller in his formation of the resurrection narratives. So we find scholars are reconstructing the documents that way. And when we look at these reconstructions, we find that there is good hope for Muslims and Christians in their dialogues, in that Muslims no longer need to deny that Jesus was put on the cross, but Muslims can say it looks like though one of the early Christian beliefs about Jesus being assumed into heaven from the tomb, that may have been what the Quran is referring to, and we can see that there is a confluence of ideas here. Now, Dieter Zeller said something that Daniel Smith doesn't agree with, but it seems that he's right on point. In the Q Gospel saying in chapter 11, I believe it's verse number 29, where the sign of Jonah is mentioned. So Dieter Zeller thinks that this means that Jesus would be rescued alive, just as Jonah was alive. And in fact, this seems to gel with the Muslim idea that Jesus was neither killed nor crucified. It looks like God rescued him alive and raised him into heaven. Now, often when we say that Jesus did not die, well, Christians retort, but wait a minute, he came back to life, he met with all of his disciples and so on. Surely he would have told them the truth of all of this. But notice that the scholars do not accept that Jesus actually came out and met with his disciples. They think that this is later myth and legend, and that the original story was much simpler, with Jesus being assumed from the tomb into heaven. Thank you all for your patient listening. I look forward to Tony's rebuttals.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Shabir. All right, Dr. Tony, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. Let me know when you're ready, and I will start your time.
Yep, I'm ready.
All right, you got it for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Shabir, for that presentation. So the primary issue here is that when we look at the New Testament documents and we simply allow the documents to speak, It's very clear from Mark, from Matthew, from Luke, from John, from all the letters of the New Testament that Jesus died, was buried, was resurrected, and we also believe he ascended. The ascension of Jesus, of course, was a later event after the resurrection. 40 days after his resurrection, he ascended. But I want you to notice that Dr. Shabir resorted to talking about scholars, and it may have been, it seems that this was the way, and they're trying to reconstruct. A lot of these approaches are speculative at best. For example, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4 is considered to be the earliest creed of the Christian church. James Dunn said it originated within months of the death of Jesus. Gerd Ludemann, a very sharp critic of the New Testament, said that that creed dates no later than 5 years of the death of Jesus, and so on. And even the whole question about Q is a hypothetical document. There is no Q document out there in museum that we can look at. It is simply a conjectural document that scholars have thought up to account for the same language that is used in both Matthew and Luke, where they differ with Mark. But the problem with Q is a saying source. Q is not talking about the various miracles of Jesus and the acts of Jesus and his death and so forth. They are primarily what is sometimes called the Dominical sayings, that is, the sayings of the Lord. Now, in terms of Mark 16, I agree with Shabir that it ends at verse 8, but what you still have is a resurrection, because when the women come to the tomb, the young man at the tomb, which is an angel in other accounts, the young man tells the women, why do you seek the living among the dead? Why are you here? He's not here. He is raised. He has been raised. He's no longer here. He has been raised just as he said. Well, where did he say that? Well, Mark 10, 32-33, and the other passion predictions in Mark. We see that in Matthew. We see it in Luke, where Jesus predicts he is going to die. They are going to kill him by crucifixion, and then he will be raised from the dead. And so the language of resurrection in the New Testament would be absolutely meaningless unless Jesus of Nazareth had died. To be resurrected means to be raised from the dead. And as Raymond Brown put it, the language of resurrection has to be explained. And to claim that the appearances of Jesus are later embellishments, this goes directly against not just the testimony of the Gospels that Jesus did in fact appear. Even in Mark 16, verse 7, there is an appearance that is predicted in Galilee where he will appear to them in Galilee. And every manuscript of Mark has verse 7. And so when scholars speculate and say, well, verse 7 probably was in part of the original Markan Gospel, where's the evidence for that? Where's the proof for that? Every manuscript that we have of the Gospel of Mark has verse 7 in it. And so it seems to me that Dr. Ali's approach is ad hoc. He is coming to the New Testament with Islamic glasses on, and he knows about Surah 4, verse 157, وَمَا قَتَلَهُ وَمَا صَلَبَهُ. They killed him not, they certainly did not crucify him. And it goes on to say that those who differ on this are just arguing over a conjecture. Well, it's not Christians who are arguing about this. It's not Christians who are differing on the fact that Jesus died. Christianity has been teaching this for 2,000 years. But it would seem that our Muslim friends are still contending over this. And what Shabir is proposing instead that we accept is the apparent death theory, or sometimes known as the swoon theory, which was once held among academics until 1835, where it was put to death and buried, no pun intended, by David Frederick Strauss. And it's the same view that is held by the Ahmadiyya sect in Islam today, that Jesus simply swooned on the cross. He wasn't really dead. But the Gospels make it very clear that Jesus really did die. In fact, it uses the language to give up the ghost, to expire, to breathe his last. And it's very clear from the Gospels that Jesus could not have survived the crucifixion, if we also take into consideration the spear wound to the side as well. And so I think it's very clear from the New Testament, if we just allow the text to speak for themselves, the neutral observer, the neutral reader will see that the New Testament Gospels teach that Jesus not only predicted his death, that he was killed and was raised the third day. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tony, for that 5-minute rebuttal. All right, Shabir, you are up for your 5-minute rebuttal. Let me know you're ready, and I'll start your time.
Sure. I'm ready.
All right, you got it for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Tony, for that active engagement with some of the points that I raised. Let me also, in good spirit, respond to some of the points that you made. You say all of the New Testament writers attest to the same thing, Jesus resurrected from the dead. But that's the whole point of Daniel Smith's book. He shows step by step that document after document in the New Testament, they are dealing with two paradigms for the vindication of Jesus. One is the paradigm which is noted from the Q Gospel, that Jesus was assumed into heaven. And the other paradigm is that he resurrected from the dead and then he finally ascended. And they're trying to piece these two together. But we can see that while history is written by the victors, and the victorious view of the two is the resurrection view, and that is being championed in all of the narratives, nonetheless, we can see remnants of the previous view that Jesus was actually assumed probably from the tomb. And of course, he could have been assumed from the cross as well, which is one of the interpretations of the Gospel of Peter. So there are early indications that there was another view, and that view got covered up by being assimilated into narratives which champion the view that he resurrected, the view that you're presenting, Tony. So as for 1 Corinthians being the earliest creed, yes, that is one of the earliest creeds that we have. That is what survives in the victorious documents by the group that feels that resurrection is the best way of presenting this. But that doesn't mean that this was the only belief among Christians. No, another belief is now recovered. And Mark 16, you're saying, has verse number 7 in all manuscripts. Nobody has denied that, Tony. What I've said, if you go back over the tape, you will find, is that the pre-Markan source lacked what is now in Mark chapter 16, verse number 7. So the question is, where did Mark get this from? It's not in his source. So the source, though, indicates a presentation of the empty tomb scenario in which there is no promise that Jesus is going to appear to his disciples in Galilee. Why? Because that is the assumption paradigm in which the man of God is taken up from this world. He disappears. He's being kept by God for a future role. He will come back in the future, but he's not going to appear to his disciples in the immediate time zone. So that's a different paradigm. Yes, the Gospel according to Mark is subscribing to the resurrection theory. As Daniel Smith has shown, this is what the Gospels are doing. But underlying that presentation and that veneer of resurrection is that assumption paradigm. And as for the soon theory, you say that Strauss put it to rest, but in what way? Strauss basically saying, if he was half dead after all of these wounds and so on, how would he convince his followers that he resurrected from the dead? But that is assuming that all of these narratives in the Gospels, for example, the Gospel according to Luke, where, for example, you say he showed them the nail wounds and all of that these are true. But modern scholars do not regard these as being true. So we're left with the bare idea that Jesus, according to historians, he died on the cross or he died by crucifixion. He could have died later on in the tomb or whatever. They say crucifixion is the cause without pinpointing the exact moment of his death, despite what the Gospels say about this, which nonetheless are contradictory, saying, he cried out and then the curtain of the tomb was torn in two from top to bottom. And then another Gospel says that he cried out after that. So did he, at what point did he die? The Gospels do not agree, nor can historians tell us when specifically Jesus died. And as for the spear wound, this is known to be non-historical. You mentioned Raymond Brown. Father Brown says this very plainly, that this is introduced by the Gospel according to John for John's own theological purposes. It's not historical. So leaving out the spear wound, what would have caused the actual death of Jesus? Now, you mentioned that there are certain facts which are agreed on by historians, that he died by crucifixion, he was buried, the empty tomb was discovered, and he began to appear to his disciples disciples, and that was the origin of the Christian way. But notice that you can only cite neutral scholars like Robert Funk for the first item. When we come to the other items, there's great disagreement. Perhaps Jesus wasn't buried. Perhaps the tomb wasn't discovered empty. Perhaps he didn't appear in physical ways as described in the Gospels. And the Christian way originated way before this, according to Stephen Patterson. So I think it is very clear that the earlier view is the better one, and that is closer to the Islamic view that Jesus was assumed probably from the tomb.
All right, guys, thank you so much for those openings and rebuttals. So now we're going to jump into cross-examination of every part of every debate. Once again, this cross-examination will be 40 minutes. Each of you will get 20 minutes each to ask questions, cross-examine their interlocutor. All right, start with Dr. Tony. You are up to cross-examine Dr. Shabir.
Okay, thank you. I'm ready. Thank you, Shabir, for your rebuttal period there as well. So Shabir, in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 34, which I quoted at the beginning, this is one of three passion predictions where Jesus tells the disciples, we are going up to Jerusalem, and he said, the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, they will spit on him, they will flog him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise. Do you believe that that these are the words of Jesus?
Now, if I speak of belief, then I have to invoke like my Islamic apparatus and say, from an Islamic point of view, if we're asking about history, then we're going to invoke what historians are saying about this. So in terms of the historians, historians do not generally take these to be actual predictions from Jesus in these forms as they are. And they note that the Gospel according to John does not have these predictions, but rather the contrary. The Gospel according to John shows that when they visited the tomb, they still had not known the predictions that Jesus was supposed to rise from the dead. So that's history. As for the Muslim belief does not require me one way or another to comment on this. The Quran speaks very highly of Jesus, highly of the New Testament, highly of the Gospel, and prima facie, it gives the impression that whatever is in the Gospels must be true. But on the other hand, the Quran also says that people concocted things, they wrote things with their own hands. The Quran also clearly stands against some of the things which are very well known from the Gospels, like, for example, the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. And so the Quran is, on the one hand, praising the previous scriptures, but at the same time cautioning Muslims in terms of accepting everything as they are.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you don't believe Jesus actually said these words because the Quran is the standard by which you're judging the gospel accounts. Is that correct?
I haven't actually said that, but what I've said is that we have two different approaches to my answer to that question. One is that I can answer from the Islamic point of view, or I can answer from a historical point of view. I mean, as a human being, I'm both a Muslim and I'm also learning from history. So,
okay, so from a historical point of view, as a neutral historian looking at a text, so at this New Testament text, does Jesus predict his death and his resurrection?
The texts show that he's doing that, but of course historians do not accept that he actually said those things.
But do historians believe he actually died on the cross?
Generally, historians take for granted that Jesus died by crucifixion, whether on the cross or in the tomb or during the embalmment or whatever it might be, like the wrapping with the spices, because they do not take for a fact that he came back to life. Otherwise, if we start entertaining the possibility that Jesus was there dining with his disciples for up to 40 days later, historians will say, as E.P. Sanders says in his book, Paul, A Very Short Introduction, we must then ask, how can we be sure that he was really dead in the first place? So you can't have it both ways, that historians say he died and then,
Well, okay, but this brings us back to the question of worldview. That's why I started off by saying I believe in the supernatural. I believe God is able to do miracles and intervene into human affairs. So we understand there are many academics who are not theists. We understand there's agnostics, there's atheists, and of course, the idea of the supernatural would be a worldview that they would not be able to entertain because of their philosophical presuppositions. But as a theist, Shabir, someone who believes in God, the resurrection of Jesus should not be a problem. The question is that being filtered through your Islamic preconceived ideas, or is it the text itself that is raising doubts in your mind?
Even as a theist, Tony, like you said, dead men don't walk out of the morgue. Well, if what appeared to have been a dead man actually walks out of the morgue, then we'll go back to check all of the medical records to see if he was really dead in the first place. So now, if we hear that Jesus was, dining with his disciples up to 40 days later, right, then we presume that a man died sometime after the last time he was seen alive. So theists should presume this, atheists should presume this. This is just a fact of life and a basic presupposition and axiom in all historical and criminal investigation. So if he was seen alive, then he could not have died on the cross. That's a basic axiomatic truth. So if to overturn that, we would have to find such clear evidence that he actually died on the cross. And what we're seeing is things like the spear wound, which are questionable.
But if he had died and was clinically dead and he was seen alive, then the only word that you and I can use to explain such an incident would have to be resurrection. If he died and truly was clinically dead, and then he returned to life, was seen alive by the disciples, this obviously, would this not explain why the disciples use the language of resurrection?
Well, you mentioned clinically dead. There are different definitions of death. Clinical death for some people means that the heart stopped.
The heart stopped. Yeah, they're not breathing anymore.
Yes, of course. But by modern standards, Tony, we would have to hook this person up to an ECG and an EEG to test for, heartbeat, right, to test for brain activity. So a person could be clinically dead by heart stoppage, but the person is still alive brain-wise. And a person can be in a coma for a long time. We all know this in modern times. So the conclusion of the disciples, based on their simple observations, is not, for Christians and Muslims for all time, the final word on the matter. Christians and Muslims can still think about what were the possibilities of thought in the ancient world and how that coincides with or is different from our modern thought patterns.
So even in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 37, where it says that Jesus cried out with loud voice and he breathed his last, the word there is, the word that is used there is ekpaneo. Are you aware of what the word ekpaneo means in the Greek text of the New Testament?
I'm not very well schooled in Greek, but I know that Father Raymond Brown has said that the word there means expired, literally. And, you can take expired to mean that he died, which is natural for Mark's gospel. That's what they're trying to say, that he died. Or you can say that that's an interesting coincidence that Mark used that term, because there is other evidence that Jesus did not actually die at the time when the gospel writers say that he died.
Well, it's also used in Luke 23, verse 46, and according to Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich, the classical lexicon for Greek New Testament, it says that ekpaneo means to breathe out one's life, soul, expire, die. And in Loba Anida's Greek English lexicon, they say it's to engage in the final act of dying. And so would you not agree that, at least according to the standard lexicon, this is a standard word, which means to die, to expire, to give up the ghost?
Yeah, Tony, I'm not denying that the gospel writers, whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, are trying to tell us that Jesus died. So, we can't twist their words to make them say something opposite to what clearly they intend. So I agree that this is what the gospel writers are saying. But what you have just quoted me from the lexicon shows that the word can have a variety of meanings, including that the person died. As I said, it's ironic that Mark used this term, which it has some ambiguity in it.
Yeah, if you look at every usage of that term, including the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's always used in narratives where it's recording the death of a person, like Jacob, Abraham, or other biblical figures. So I will leave it at that, Shabir. Let me just move on to my next question. Now, you mentioned something about something earlier than the New Testament texts. Do you have any documentary evidence for any of these documents that you claim predate the New Testament?
Well, Christians have long said that that the Gospels that are based on previous documents or oral tradition. For example, Luke himself says that others have drawn up narratives before him, and he is determined to write, a factual account. So Christian scholars generally think that this means that Luke is using previous documents. And not only do they think so, they now, many of them conclude that Luke was using Mark as one of his sources, and also Q. So the fact that Q does not exist now as a complete written document in its original form does not prevent scholars from positing with good evidence that there is literary dependence between Matthew and Luke on a previous document. Of course, the existence of Q and its being a source for Matthew and Luke is not as firmly fixed as Mark and priority. So, I mean, there are different degrees of confidence that scholars can have on a matter, especially when there are different interpretations. For example, with Mark Goodacre having a contrary view that Luke, for example, depended on Matthew. But even there, Luke is using a previous written source. So it is not inconceivable that Matthew and Luke used a previous written source. And that would explain the verbal similarities between Matthew and Luke.
Right. So I'm not ruling out the idea that we could posit, we could speculate. All scholars do that, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, Bhagavad Gita, whichever source it may be. But in terms of what we have in our hands, textual sources, is there anything earlier than the New Testament documents that give a life of Jesus and describe the end of his life and so forth? Anything that you could mention that we have in our hands, textually speaking, that predates the New Testament documents?
We do not have anything that is so complete and comprehensive as the New Testament documents, but there are documents which, though being later than the New Testament documents, nonetheless, according to scholars, preserve snippets which are from an earlier time. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. Some of these sayings are found by scholars, for example, Fame Parkins, to be in an earlier form than the similar sayings which are there in the synoptic Gospels in the Bible. And the Gospel of Peter, though written later, has been reconstructed, stage by stage by Arthur Dewey, and he has shown that the earliest stage of the Gospel of Peter actually is from the mid-1st century, which means that it predates the written Gospels. But of course, we do not have that early stage as a document intact. We only have it within the layered document that is now the Gospel of Peter, which is probably from the middle of the 2nd century.
Right. And so these 2nd century documents, like Thomas and Peter, you are aware of the fact that the Gospel of Thomas copiously copies or has copies or repetitions that are found in the Synoptic Gospels themselves.
As I've said, there are similar sayings in Thomas and the Synoptic Gospels. I have not studied it to the extent to be able to decipher whether or not Thomas copied the Synoptics or the Synoptics copied Thomas. But what I do recall, and I think is of very important significance here, is that Fame Perkins and other scholars say that some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are in an earlier form than the form in which they appear in the Synoptic Gospels.
Right, right, and I would say that those are speculative. But let me just add another question, as I'm the one that's supposed to be asking the questions right now at this point. You mentioned earlier that the creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 4, you said that it's one of the creeds and that the winners write history. Paul said he received that creed and passed it on. Where did Paul receive that creed from, or who did he receive it from?
This is unknown. Paul does not state who he got it from and when he got it. But I respect Christian scholars like James D.G. Dunn, who suppose that Paul must have got it from the original disciples of Jesus when he went to visit them in Jerusalem. But of course, this is a supposition, but it's the best that Christian scholars can do. Otherwise, in terms of Islamic terminology, we would say this is majhul. It is unknown. Paul got it from some unknown source. He doesn't state his source.
Right. But whoever he received it from, this is an early creed that is clearly not his own, and that it's a creed that does contain the belief in the death of Jesus, the vicarious nature of his death, and his burial and resurrection. And so we could at least admit that this early creed does affirm the death of Jesus and his resurrection from the dead. You would agree with that?
That is an early creed from some unknown source. So I will agree that some Christians before Paul had this belief, and Paul took that belief and championed it. But it was not the only belief. The Corinthians himself, to whom he's writing, do not buy it all, because Paul is saying to them, look, I told you before, and I'm telling you again. But in the meantime, from his first telling them, and now he's telling them again, the Corinthians some of them are saying there is no resurrection from the dead, which means that they do not buy it all.
Right. Well, I would think that has more to do with the Greek philosophical view of the body. But would you also agree, Shabir, that the earliest text, I think you've already said this already, but you would agree that the earliest text that we have right now, if we were to just let the New Testament text speak for themselves, we would have to come to the conclusion that these earliest texts do affirm Jesus of Nazareth really died. It doesn't deny his ascension, but that he really died and that he was raised to death. And this is what the early Christians preached in the book of Acts. So the book of Acts chapter 2, you would agree that is an early source of Christian preaching of the gospel that would contain the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Tony, I feel that it's essential that we avoid circular reasoning. Circular reasoning occurs in a debate where when somebody assumes something that is so close to the topic at hand that if we were to assume that, we wouldn't be having a debate in the first place. So if our debate was, does the New Testament affirm that Jesus died and resurrected from the dead, then your question would be most appropriate. But since our question is really, did Jesus resurrect from the grave, then you cannot start by assuming that the New Testament is the Word of God and therefore it says so and therefore it is so. So your question is, does the New Testament affirm that? Yes, I never denied that, but I'm saying that behind what the New Testament affirms, there is an underlying story about assumption rather than resurrection from the dead. Assumption from the tomb, translation, if you will, where Jesus is taken up from this earth, he's preserved by God for a future role.
So the New Testament writers, you are aware that the New Testament writers also recognize that in addition to the resurrection, Jesus also ascended into heaven. And all this language, would you not agree, is part of the vindication language that is used in the New Testament for what happened to Jesus post-mortem?
So what Daniel Smith shows about this is that there was still the need for the vindication of Jesus if you have Jesus on the resurrection paradigm, because the resurrection reverses the death, but the resurrection by itself does not really show that Jesus is preserved for a future role. Think of Matthew's gospel where Jesus says, "I'm with you to all the ages." So in this case, Jesus is not being taken away to be preserved for a future role. He's just here. But Luke has him ascend, and that now preserves him for a future role. He ascends and he promises, "You're going to see me coming back just as you've seen me ascending." With the other paradigm of assumption, Jesus is being taken up by God, and he's preserved for a future role. There are two different paradigms. One goes to the resurrection paradigm. One still needs the ascension. But the earliest proclamation, which was about the assumption or translation of Jesus from earth into heaven, this did not need a subsequent ascension. So Luke obviously has delayed the ascension. He's taken it away from the assumption, which is, you have in the assumption, you have crucifixion followed by being raised to heaven. In the resurrection, you have crucifixion followed by resurrection followed by ascension, being raised to heaven. So you have a middle term here, which is introduced by Luke and the other gospel writers. They have stretched out the time frame to include appearances of Jesus to his disciples.
Would you agree that the earliest witnesses who were disciples of Jesus would be in a better position to know what happened to Jesus than what later scholars would speculate actually happened?
Yes and no. In some things, the disciples would be better witnesses because they could go there and examine the tomb. In some other things, the disciples may have jumped to conclusions which are not accurate. Think of Mary jumping to the conclusion in John's Gospel, "They have taken the Lord away and we do not know where they have laid him." Is that a true conclusion or a false one? So if we say it's a false conclusion, nobody took Jesus' body away, then Mary has jumped to a false conclusion. So it doesn't mean that because they were there at the time, then they're omniscient. They could make mistakes. When Peter proclaims, as you quoted him to proclaim, that we are witnesses to Jesus's, the fact that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Well, nobody actually witnessed the actual resurrection. What they concluded is an inference from what they did observe. They saw a vision of Jesus, and they concluded that Jesus is alive. So they're bearing witness to the fact that Jesus is alive. But to say that he resurrected from the dead, this is an inference, but they're bearing witness to the inference. So that's not something that the careful scholar of today would do.
All right. That's time right there. All right, Dr. Shabir, you're up to cross-examine Dr. Tony Costa.
Okay, so Tony, now you said that Jesus predicted that he would die as a ransom for many. So do you want to stress the many, or do you want to think that Jesus died for all people?
Well, I think the reference to the many there goes back to Isaiah 53, where it says that he will justify many. And so the language of giving up his life as a ransom for many is language that is evocative of the suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53. Now, in terms of my soteriology, I am a Reformed Christian, and so I hold to the belief, sometimes called Calvinism. I believe that Christ's death was for his elect, which would mean it's not a universal atonement.
Mm-hmm. So, Tony, like when a Christian friend comes to me and says, "Shabir, Jesus died for you," so I'm wondering, like, how does the Christian friend know that Jesus died for me? Because if the belief was that Jesus died for everyone, then obviously I'm included in the everyone. But so how do you explain that?
Well, I would explain it in that the person who holds to that view holds to the view that we would call Arminianism, which holds to universal atonement. And so it depends on your soteriological worldview. And so someone who holds to that Arminian view has a view of the atonement, which makes it universal. The one who holds to a Reformed or Calvinistic soteriological view of the atonement would see that atonement as particular.
Okay, good. Thank you. Tony, when you say ransom, when we think of ransom, we think of somebody being kidnapped and claiming a ransom, and the ransom is paid to the kidnapper in order to let the kidnapped person go free. So using the ransom language here, so we can ask, like, to whom is the ransom paid?
The ransom, there were various views of the ransom theory in church history, and some held to the view that the ransom was paid to Satan, to the devil. I personally don't subscribe to that. I don't see any evidence of that in the New Testament or Scripture in general, including the Old Testament. I believe the ransom was paid to God. I believe that God was the offended party in our sins, and so the ransom was paid to the court, to the heavenly court, to satisfy the justice of God and His holiness.
So is it paid to God or to the heavenly court? Is that the same thing? Like God and the heavenly court?
Yes. God is the judge. God is the judge of the heavenly court, and so yes, it would be paid to Him, and it would be fair in that it would be, the atonement would be made by His Son, by God's very Son, who would take the place of sinners.
So then the sinners would then be the ones presenting this ransom. If we're thinking of ransom money, then who's giving the payment. So in this case,
it would be Jesus.
No,
it would be Jesus Christ who takes their place, who becomes their surety. Jesus Christ takes their place, and He's the one who pays the ransom to God, because they don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the wherewithal to pay for their ransom. But someone comes and offers up that payment. Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't have to do with the will of Christians. Like, Christians are not thinking in retrospect, man, I'm so glad that Jesus died for our sins, because otherwise we would be damned. Because that would mean that Christians would have to be happy with the fact that Jesus went there and immolated Himself on the cross in order to please the Father.
Yeah, well, in Galatians 2:20, the Apostle Paul put it this way. He said that I've been crucified with Christ, but nevertheless I live. And the life that I live, he says, it is not I that lives, but Christ who lives through me. And then he says that the Son of God loved him, He loved me, and gave Himself for me. And so I look back, I mean, in my own personal walk with God, I am in eternal debt and thanks to what Christ has accomplished for me on the cross of Calvary.
Okay. Now, you say that there are 5 facts that Jesus died by crucifixion. You quote Robert Funk for that. So what do you think of E.P. Sanders saying, look, if once we hear that He is still alive and He's meeting with His disciples, we have to wonder how He actually died. Now, you mentioned the spear thrust, which, if historical, might have been the wound we hope would kill Him. I mean, not that that's not putting it right. Muslims don't hope for Jesus to die, but if you want to find something that kills Him, you would think the spear wound would do it. But in the absence of the spear wound, since crucifixion normally takes days to kill a person, why do you think that Jesus died so soon?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, let me just say, Shabir, I do believe the spear thrust is historical. I'm not. I mean, obviously, there's many other conservative scholars who would argue the same. D.A. Carson, recently, Lydia McGrew wrote a book on the eye of the beholder. The Gospel of John is historical reportage. It's an excellent work. And others like Leon Morris have made the same argument. I think the spear wound was historical. I think we do have precedents for that in the writings of the first century Roman writer Quintilian, who also mentions the coup de grace, the spear wound of crucified victims before they're taken down, just to ensure their death. I think Jesus's death was due to probably cardiac arrest. There have been studies that have been conducted on the effects of crucifixion on the human body. The Journal of the American Medical Association put out an article on this question, and their conclusions is that people could survive for days on the cross simply by rising up, expanding the rib cage, coming back down, and then. But after a while, the person would, after a while, through exhaustion, they would succumb to asphyxiation. But another factor that they also mentioned was also cardiac arrest. And I think from the gospel accounts, it's very clear that when Jesus was carrying his cross, we're told in Mark's gospel that they had to solicit the aid of Simeon of Cyrene to help him carry the cross, which would be suggestive of the fact that he was extremely weakened at that point. And I think that the description of Jesus's death in the Gospels, crying out with a great cry, I think is also medically indicative of cardiac arrest. And so I would say that Jesus died of cardiac arrest seizure.
Okay, so then we have to think about cardiac arrest, but just thinking for one more time about the spear wound. Sean Anthony, in his book Crucifixion and Death: A Spectacle, remarked that while the spear thrust was known from other cultures, the Roman method of crucifixion does not. We do not have any attestation of the use of the spear thrust, except in John's Gospel at this point. What do you think of Sean Anthony's observation about the spear thrust?
Well, yeah, I think that'd be incorrect. I had mentioned the Roman writer, first century writer, Quintilian. Even though he was writing from Hispania, which was modern day Spain, he was a Roman writer, and he attests to the fact that there were cases, not always, but there were cases where some of the victims on the cross, before being taken down and given to their family for burial, were pierced. We do have a later account of two Christian martyrs from about 290 of the Common Era, who the Roman soldiers were ordered to be dispatched and see to their crucifixion, and to take spears with them, because they were known to thank and glorify God in front of their tormentors. And then we were told that they were mortally pierced with the spears. So I don't think there's anything in John's Gospel that is out of sorts with what Romans would do to bodies to ensure that they were dead.
Okay, so leaving aside the spear thrust for now, which you confess that's not the actual thing that killed Jesus. He died of cardiac arrest. So now let's think about that. So the soldiers come to the tomb, they break the legs of the one crucified thief, then they go to the other criminal, and now they break his legs, but they come to Jesus and they see that he is already dead. How do they see that? Because Jesus is elevated on the cross, and it doesn't seem that anybody could feel his pulse or check for his heartbeat. How did they see that he is dead?
Well, I would answer that two ways. I would say, first of all, if you are an executioner and you've been executing people most of your life, you kind of get to know the signs of death and what the body looks like, and the discoloration of the body, the ashen appearance that comes upon the body. But in Mark's Gospel, it's interesting. It tells us there that Pilate was informed that Jesus had already died, and it tells us that he was surprised he died so soon, and he actually had the centurion ensure that Jesus was dead. And after the centurion had ensured that Jesus was dead, then he had his body handed over to Joseph of Arimathea. So I would say, in the same way, Shabir, that a medical doctor, a physician who is used to working in ICUs or working in cancer hospitals, many of them can detect the signs of death on a body just by looking at the body, especially when there's algor mortis, as they call it, where the blood begins to pool in various parts of the body.
Mm-hmm. So, Tony, when my mother-in-law died, that was a very sad moment for me. It was, the grief was unbelievable, because she lived with us for many years. And
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and I wasn't at home at the time. I was actually in England, giving lectures there. But my wife told me about the procedures, the coroner coming in, and they had to be this detailed procedure and so on. And we know more generally that if, somebody dies and they had pledged their organs for transference, then the laws of some states require that you must have two teams of doctors. The team that is going to harvest the organs for transplantation cannot be the team that is going to certify the death, because they're not unbiased. They want the organs, so they're going to declare the person dead probably sooner than necessary. So we must have two independent teams of doctors. Now, thinking of the centurion, when the centurion gave his assent to Pilate for the body to be taken down, or at least his assurance to Pilate that Jesus is dead, do you think the centurion at this time was unbiased?
I don't understand what you mean by unbiased. What do you mean by he was unbiased?
Well, the Gospels show that, for example, the Gospel according to Mark says that when the centurion saw the way in which Jesus died, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. In Luke's Gospel, he said, truly this man was innocent. So do you think that the centurion at this point really wants Jesus dead? Or if he could do something to let Jesus live, he might do that?
I think it's unlikely that the centurion became this immediate convert at that moment and wanted to see Jesus alive. I think he was taking orders from Pilate, and to not obey orders meant the death. In many cases, it could mean severe penalties. I don't think he was biased at all. I think he was just doing his job and obeying orders from the governor.
Now, the governor himself, according to Matthew's Gospel, washed his hands in public, wanting nothing to do with the death of Jesus. Do you think that the governor himself, if he could have done something to let Jesus go free, he might have done that?
No, I don't think Pilate was. I don't think Pilate was a friend of Jesus in that sense, or friendly or amicable to Jesus. I think we need to understand what's going on behind the scenes. The New Testament doesn't tell us this, but we do know that Pilate was in trouble with Tiberius, the emperor who reigned during the time of Jesus, and that the Emperor Tiberius had put Pilate on notice. Tiberius was receiving a lot of complaints from Judea, from the Sanhedrin, religious priests, that Pilate was disrespecting their religion and doing things that were unlawful and so forth. Tiberius wanted peace in the empire. I don't think Pontius Pilate cared about the Jews in general, including Jesus. I think what he was doing was he was basically pushing back against the religious leaders. He didn't want to give them what they wanted, which was a verdict of crucifixion for Jesus. And you will notice that what pushed his hand was when the religious leaders said, if you let this man go, you are not a friend of Caesar. And that is an official title, an honorific title that soldiers would receive from the emperor. And by basically saying you're not a friend of Caesar, what they're basically saying is, indirectly, I believe what they were saying was, this is going to be reported back to Tiberius. And I think at that point he knew that there was nothing he could do. And so by washing his hands, I think he was basically saying, I'm free of this guy's blood. You do with him as you will. But I think that we need to understand what's going on behind the scenes, Shabir. Pilate was nervous. He's under notice. And later we find out that Pilate was in fact exiled. And according to tradition, he committed suicide.
Mm-hmm. So do you think there's anything to the suggestion that, with Pilate's arm being twisted, he's in a tight spot, he wants Jesus to go free, but he can't. If he could find a secret way to let Jesus go free, and let me not say a secret way as if we're talking about some conspiracy. If Pilate suspects in his own mind that Jesus is being taken down too soon from the cross, and perhaps he has not quite completely expired, do you think that Pilate here has an incentive to say to himself, well, wait a minute, this is the best of both worlds. I don't have to kill the guy. He appears dead, and nobody's going to report me to Tiberius Caesar because everybody thinks he's dead, but it looks like the centurion is winking at me, and maybe Jesus is not actually quite dead. Do you think that's even, is there anything to a suggestion like that?
I don't think so. I mean, it's I mean, the suggestion itself almost sounds like something that you would read in the Passover plot, which you're probably familiar with. But I don't get that at all. I mean, it almost sounds like that would be an ad hoc approach to what may have been the situation here. I don't get that sense at all, and I don't even see it in any of the gospel accounts that Pilate was trying to get this. Remember, he did not like Jews. I mean, Pilate was a rabid anti-Semite, according to Josephus and according to other writers as well. Pilate was a hard guy, and I don't think that Pilate had ingratiated himself towards Jesus at all.
Mm. Okay. So, Tony, one of the five basic facts that you start out with on which you build the case for the resurrection is the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Now, you are well aware that there are conservative Christian scholars who will say it happened exactly the way it is in the Gospels. And then there are critical historians who say that, no, it didn't occur the way it is in the Gospels. The Gospels, especially the Gospel of Luke, gives us this scenario of Jesus eating with his disciples, being touched, and John has the nail wound and so on. So these are all later legends, according to these scholars. I mean, you quoted Gerd Ludemann, and Gerd Ludemann wrote a book called The Great Deception, in which he clearly states Jesus did not rise from the dead. So do you have a list of some critical historical scholars who would say that, yeah, Jesus appeared just like described in the Gospels?
Well, I think that Gerd Ludemann, in his earlier book, What Really Happened to Jesus, he says this about the postmortem appearances: it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death, in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And I think Paula Fredrickson, who's a Jewish scholar of early Christianity, Fredrickson also makes that claim that there is no doubt that they saw something. Now, as I pointed out earlier, Shabir, as a conservative academic and as a Christian, I believe that the appearances of Jesus were faithfully recorded as we find them in the Gospels. Skeptics like Ludemann and even Fredrickson have to admit that something happened. They saw something, and they believe that these appearances were of the risen Jesus. And I think that it was those appearances that solidified and cemented their faith in the resurrection. It was not just the empty tomb in and of itself. I think that was insufficient to confirm their convictions. So I personally believe, as a conservative, I believe that the disciples, the gospel writers, the evangelists were faithful in the recording of the postmortem appearances of Jesus.
You mentioned Lydia McGrew, and you are aware of this debate going on between Licona and Lydia McGrew. Licona's book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, is I believe an important read, even for those who might disagree with him. But what do you think of Licona's view that the description of these saints coming out of the graves at the time of Jesus' crucifixion is something like special effects, as he calls them? Do you think this description in Matthew is factual?
Yes, I believe that the description in Matthew 27 of the saints being raised, their tombs opening and then them coming out and appearing in the holy city, I believe it is literal. And I do understand Michael Licona and I were good friends. We studied under the same doctoral supervisor. I don't agree with his view. I know that William Lane Craig also holds to that view, that it's an apocalyptic genre that appears there. I think that this is a unique piece of material that is unique to Matthew, that Matthew had access to, and I believe that this event literally happened.
All right, guys, thank you so much for that great cross-examination.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to transition to our closing remarks. And once again, that'll be 5-minute closings for each party. Start with Dr. Tony. You're up for your 5-minute closing. And then we'll go, once after the closing, we'll go take a break, 5-minute break, and then we'll go into Q&A. All right, guys? So Dr. Tony, you're up for your 5-minute closing.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank again my good friend Shabir Ali. As I've said, we've known each other for 30 years, and he's always been a gentleman in our interactions, and so I'm very appreciative of that, and I hope that I've fulfilled the task of mutually being the same way towards him. Dear friends, you've heard two views tonight. Did Jesus resurrect from the grave? I started off, if you remember, in my opening statement by talking about the Gospel of Mark, which most academics, most scholars of the New Testament believe is the earliest gospel. And in the earliest Gospel of Mark, we have three predictions of Jesus called the Passion announcements, where he predicts his impending death in Jerusalem. I think it's very clear if we just let the texts speak for themselves. If you are just a neutral reader for the first time, just letting the texts speak for themselves, there is no doubt that someone will walk away thinking that Jesus actually didn't really die on the cross. The Gospels are very clear that not only did Jesus predict his demise, he predicted his return to life, which would be resurrection. And he even predicted that he would meet with his disciples again, that he would meet them, for example, in Galilee. I also looked at the earliest Christian creed. Shabir was admitting the fact that that creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3-4 is, he said it's one of the earliest creeds. Now, I believe there are other creeds. I just wrote a book on early Christian creeds and hymns that is coming out in August, which deals with the creeds of the New Testament and the hymns within the New Testament. But it's very clear that that creed that Paul cites is again mentions the death of Jesus, his burial, his resurrection, and then his appearances to his disciples and the witnesses. Paul says that he received that it's not his own. He received it and passed it on. Well, who are the only candidates that would have been disciples before Paul? Well, the only candidates would have to be the apostles, Peter, John, James, Philip, and so forth. And Peter, the Apostle Paul tells us in Galatians 1 and 2 that after his conversion to the Christian movement, he tells us that he went to Jerusalem and he spent time with Peter and spent 14 days with him. And as C.H. Dodd famously remarked, they weren't talking about the weather for 2 weeks. They were talking about Jesus, and it was from that point that many scholars believe that Paul would have received this creed that would have been confessed in the early Jerusalem church. And some have even speculated, have argued that that creed contains Aramaic parallelisms. Why is that important? Because Aramaic was the language that Jesus spoke, that his early disciples spoke in the land of Israel. I also mentioned the early preaching material that we find in the book of Acts, chapter 2 and 3. And there we're told that in that early Christian material, the Apostle Peter talks about how you, men of Israel, you with wicked hands, you took this Jesus, this man approved of God with signs and wonders, you took him, and with evil hands you handed him over, and you killed him, and you put him to death. But God has raised him up, and we are witnesses of that fact. And so the witnesses of the fact of the resurrection, and that doesn't mean they had to be at the tomb, like stationed there with CNN to see the stone rolling over and this man coming out of the tomb. What do they mean by witnesses? Well, they not only saw the empty tomb, they also met with the risen Christ. This man was dead, and now he's alive. What is the language they use? They use the language of resurrection. Now, remember, the ascension of Jesus is also important. It's not just mentioned in Luke, in the book of Acts and in the Gospel of Luke. If we look at the Gospel of John, chapter 20, when Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, he says, I have not yet ascended to my Father. In other words, I'm yet to ascend. There is an ascension in John. And even in John's Gospel, the glorification of Jesus is not just his resurrection, but it's also his crucifixion, where he says that he's going to be raised up, just as Moses raised the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be raised up, and he will draw all people to himself. And in Matthew's Gospel, it does end with the Great Commission in Matthew 28. But remember, within the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus speaks about his return. He speaks about the coming of the Son of Man, how he will return in glory and honor to judge the nations and to collect his elect from the four corners of the world. So I think it's very clear, folks, that the New Testament documents are the earliest documents to talk about, well, this scholar assumes this, he thinks this might have been the case. These are all assumptions. They're all speculative at the end of the day. But if you let the text speak for themselves, there is no way that you can walk away from the texts thinking that Jesus actually did not die, but that he was assumed. And so I think Dr. Shabir, his approach is ad hoc. I think that his approach is simply to say, let's give the Quran its due, and let's basically conform or comport the New Testament to the Islamic version of what happened to Jesus. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Tony Costa. All right, Dr. Shabir Ali, you're up for your 5-minute closing.
Okay, I'm ready. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so glad that we have done this dialogue tonight. We have to do more such dialogue so that Christians and Muslims can get a better understanding of each other. I really enjoyed my question and answer with Tony, because by asking him some questions, I got a better understanding of the Christian faith and what Christians believe. Now, in closing, I want to reaffirm that what I started with was not that the Quran says so and therefore it must be so, and therefore let's find something in the Gospels that agree with the Quran. What I said was that Christians and Muslims have for a long time been at different starting points, with Christians saying Jesus was on the cross, Muslims saying that he wasn't on the cross. And I said that the Quran can now be interpreted by Muslims like myself, and also by academic scholars in a way that does not necessitate a denial that Jesus was on the cross. But many like myself think that it is better to interpret this to mean that Jesus was not killed by a crucifixion. The enemy thought that they had him dead, but no, God rescued him and raised him to himself. So that's one development. The other development is with Christian studies. I have shown that Daniel Smith and others have gone behind the scenes, and they have shown that while the New Testament writings all give the impression that this is the only paradigm, Jesus was crucified, he resurrected from the dead, and then he was raised up into heaven, a three-part scenario. There was another paradigm, which is hints of it are still there in the New Testament writings, but these hints are always like conflated and superseded by the resurrection paradigm. So the one that is there in the undertext, that is the assumption paradigm. Assumption doesn't mean where somebody makes an assumption and assumes something whether incorrect or correct. But assumption here is a technical term referring to God taking up a person from this earth into heaven and keeping him for a future role. We know that this was done according to the Old Testament with Enoch. He walked with God and he was no more because God took him. We know it was done with Elijah because Elijah went up in a whirlwind, and many believe that Elijah would come back at some point. This is why some people thought that Jesus was the return of Elijah, or John the Baptist was the return of Elijah. So that is the assumption paradigm. Now, with the assumption in mind, when would Jesus have been assumed into heaven according to some early Christians? Some, like in the Gospel of Peter, thought that he was assumed from the cross. Some thought that he was assumed from the tomb. And this seems to be the situation in the pre-Markan Passion narrative, according to Reginald Fuller and other scholars. Now, in a lot of what I discussed, it seems that Tony did not really get the point. He kept asserting, look, this is what all of the gospel writers say and so on. But he is missing the point that, yes, that's the history that is written by the victors, but there is another history which is not there. So he says, this is 1 Corinthians, the earliest creed we have. But he's missing the point that there was another creed, and that there's another belief that Jesus was assumed from the tomb into heaven. And as for the 1 Corinthians creed, we don't know where Paul got it from. You can assume that Paul got it when he met Peter, but who else did Paul meet and who else did he get things from? Now, Dieter Zeller, as I said, he's not a Muslim, he's a Christian scholar writing in German, and he says that the sign of Jonah in the Q saying 11:29-30 indicates possibly that Jesus was saved by God, rescued alive, as Jonah was rescued alive. So now, with this in mind, we can see that there are indications that Jesus may not have actually died at the time when the writers of the New Testament say that he died. Tony was saying the spear thrust must have killed him, and we had some discussion about the spear thrust, and we couldn't come to an agreement. But Tony said Jesus must have died of a heart attack. Well, if he died of a heart attack, I asked Tony, how would the observers on the ground know that he died of a heart attack? So Tony started to assume maybe they saw the discoloration of his skin and so on. But who would have seen that is the centurion, who is by definition the head of 100 soldiers, and he by this time had already proclaimed that Jesus is innocent. He is sorry that Jesus had to go through this. Pilate himself didn't want Jesus dead. So if Pilate and the centurion could wink at each other and let Jesus come down from the cross alive, I think they would have done so. In short, there is no proof that Jesus actually died on the cross, and there is good reason to believe with the earliest Christians that Jesus was assumed into heaven, and that corresponds closely to the Quranic paradigm in Surah 4, verses 157 to 158. Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you so much once again for this debate, man. I think the live chat got a lot out of it. You guys put some great information out there, and I really appreciate the decorum you guys share. I could tell you guys have some history together, and you guys know how to articulate yourselves in a way that's professional, and that fundamental aspect of loving towards each other. So with that said, we're going to take a break here, 5-minute break, and let you guys refresh yourselves and do what you got to do. And in that time, I got some stuff to go over. So I will be looking out for you guys to return. And until that time, I'll be taking the stage. So in a minute. All right, folks, man. I hope you guys are liking the debate so far. It is, I'm really enjoying it, because it's difficult sometimes. You get guys in that's experienced and they've been on the stage so many times. Sometimes they have the habit of maybe not taking it as serious per se, or being a little bit aggressive on the stage because that's just how they're used to doing things. But I really appreciate this type of conversation that they're having, because what it does, it allows us as the audience to view it and really, really dig in and listen to what they're saying, right? To really dig into listen to what they're saying, and not necessarily just take what they're saying for granted, because now they're coming with a tone that you can receive what they're saying and listen to what they're saying, and that's always an enjoyable one. So I hope that you guys are enjoying the conversation just as much as I am enjoying it myself. But that said, so some folks who are just new to the Gospel Truth and who has recently subscribed to the Gospel Truth, what I want to do is sort of play this video just to give, let me see if this is the right video. I don't even think this is the right video, but let me see if I can load it up real quick. But I want to play this video to give those who are new subscribers an idea of what the Gospel Truth wants to do. And let me see if I can find it real quick. I think I can. Let me see. Hold on, I may have to pull it up a different way here so I can make sure that I pull up the right one. I thought I had the correct one loaded, but apparently not. I did not have the correct one loaded, unfortunately. But let me pull it up real quick and see if I can get this thing loaded for you to allow my new subscribers to sort of get a feel of the things that we're trying to do here on the Gospel Truth. Doesn't look like it's cooperating. Let me see real quick. Let me make sure these guys haven't returned yet too. Why is it doing that? Hold on, guys. Anyway, we're waiting for the guys to return. So I'm trying to pull this thing up, but it doesn't look like it's allowing me. In alphabetical order. Let me see. Hold on, guys. I think I have it here. Just trying to. Yeah, it's not. It doesn't look like it wants to behave here. Is this it? Yeah, I think this is it right here. So let me drag this over here real quick. Let's see if this is it. And I think this is it. So what I want you guys to do, or my new subscribers, I want you guys to see this video just to sort of give a understanding of what the Gospel Truth has going on and the plans of the Gospel Truth. So, or sort of just the fundamental basis of what the Gospel Truth is all about. So here it is. The goal of the Gospel Truth is to engage the culture of Christian truth. But what does that mean? To engage the culture of Christian truth is to put fear aside and address the areas of the culture that needs to be addressed. It's an approach to culture that leads in it with God. As humans, there is a Christian truth. It should be every member of the body of Christ's mission to engage as many people as possible with the hopes of winning them to Christ. This is the vision of the gospel of truth, to engage the culture with Christian truth with the hope that God will call them into a glorious and wonderful relationship with Him. All right, so that was for those who are new patrons, or not new patrons. Maybe you can become a patron, but new subscribers to the Gospel Truth. So I just want to play that and just make sure you guys have an understanding of what the mission and what the vision of the Gospel Truth is. Obviously, it's spearheading the gospel, right? I mean, putting these debates together is not just simply a venture of trying to build entertainment. This is definitely something that God has put on my heart to do with the gospel at the center. So, if you didn't know what the Gospel Truth page was all about, what was some of the mission statement, if you will, for the Gospel Truth, that was it. So it looked like my interlocutors have returned. So now we can go ahead and jump into this Q&A. Welcome back, guys. So we have a whole bunch of questions here. And so we're going to jump right into this. And I have a question for Shabir. Once this thing loads up, it's freezing up a little bit there. Let me pull it up again. Look like it didn't come all the way through. All right, there it is. All right, question for Shabir. Historically speaking, crucified victims had a 1% survival rate. Death ratio, Josephus, friends surviving. Are you taking the position that the least likeliest thing to occur? I think you're muted, Dr. Shabir.
Yeah. So the survival of a crucified person, or usually, person surviving any execution, the chance of that is very minor. That's granted, whether it's crucifixion or electric chair or whatever. But if we hear that the person who was executed last week is having dinner with his buddies this week, we know that something is wrong. Now, we don't generally quickly conclude that, okay, this person resurrected from the dead. We want to go back and look at the records, like who supervised this execution? Were they unbiased? Was there a friend on the inside who might have, done something to let this person escape death, and so on. So that's all I'm saying. We know that it is possible, even if it's a 1% survival chance, but it was possible. And this just happens to be the one case where it actually happened. In fact, if it is, that's what happened. I mean, this is a hypothesis at the end of the day, but to me, it's a good hypothesis. It brings together so many other pieces of evidence. The fact that Pilate didn't want Jesus dead, the centurion didn't want Jesus dead. Even, I should add, the Jewish opponents of Jesus, by the end, did not want Jesus dead. Luke's gospel says that they went away from the scene beating their breasts, and you can see that means that they are repentant for what they have done.
All right, Dr. Tony?
Yeah, what I would do is I would recommend folks look up the Journal of the American Medical Association. They did a great study on the effects of crucifixion on the body. And they show that, among other factors, cardiac arrest is one of them. They also talk about asphyxiation. So I think it'd be worth your while to look at the effects of crucifixion on the body. And I think that the point of crucifixion was primarily to torture people with a slow, agonizing death. Sometimes those deaths could be quick, depending on the several factors. Again, Jesus was exhausted by the fact that he needed Simon of Cyrene to carry the crossbeam to the place of crucifixion, is indicative of the fact that he was exhausted. This could have been to the brutal scourging that he received from the Roman whip. And so in the case of Jesus, I think it's very clear from the gospel accounts that Jesus of Nazareth died, I think, of cardiac arrest, with the great cry from the cross, and also the piercing, the blood and the water that comes out of the side, I think is also indicative of the pericardial effusion that would have been around the heart. The pericardial membrane would have been inflated, and mixed with blood in the ventricles of the heart, it would emit what John saw as blood and water.
All right.
And
we
it
have
sounds like
question.
the 4th of July began early.
Well, yeah, Canada. We're getting ready to celebrate Canada Day, and some folks in the background are bursting fireworks. So excuse that. I cannot control that, folks. I didn't expect it. But
it's you, Shabir. Okay. It's blame the Canadians.
Well, I know for a fact it's happening here, so I'm a witness to that.
All right, cool. It's all good. Here's another question for you, Tony. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 4 mentions that Jesus rose again according to the scriptures. Can you show where in scripture that Paul might be alluding to?
I think that the according to the scriptures is a cumulative statement. It's like the statement in Matthew 2:23 where it says that when Mary and Joseph returned with the child Jesus from Egypt, it says they resided in Nazareth, as it is written in the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. And so I think that the reference to the 3 days, the possible reference to that is probably Hosea 6:2. After 3 days, the Lord will revive us. There is a 3-day motif that appears throughout the scriptures. For example, when Abraham was told to sacrifice his son Isaac, it says he took him to Mount Moriah, and it says on the 3rd day when they arrived there, he saw the place. On the 3rd day, God descended on Mount Sinai and gave the 10 Commandments to Israel. There's a saying among the rabbis that the righteous will not suffer beyond 3 days. So there's this sense of the 3-day being the day of deliverance in Rabbinic Judaism.
All right, Dr. Shabir.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Tony mentioned Hosea chapter 6 in reference to this, because it says there, after 2 days, God will revive us. Then on the 3rd day, he will raise us. First of all, within context, the Hosea passage was referring to the Jewish nation, which never actually died. It went into a low state, but then it experienced a revival by the grace of God, a healing and a revival. But healing and revival, is very pertinent to our debate here, because we've been asking, how do we know that Jesus actually died? And this passage, which is, the one that scholars turn to very quickly for the 3-day motif, when Paul says he died, he raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. So this is a passage that speaks about healing and recovery, which means that Jesus wasn't dead. He was wounded. God healed him in 2 days and raised him on the 3rd day, probably from the tomb.
All right. And here's another question for you, Shabir. All right. How do you deal with all church history and the very students of the apostles and even heretics confirming the death of Christ and resurrection since the beginning?
So the idea that Jesus died became widespread. This is true, but according to the way in which people thought at the time, people at the time they assumed that a person died if they saw a lack of movement in a person. Look at Mark chapter 9. A boy was knocked to the ground by a demon possession, and people said he is dead, but of course he wasn't dead. People called Jesus to heal a girl, and they said the girl is dead. Jesus said she's not dead, she's only sleeping. In Acts of the Apostles, Eutychus falls, and Luke actually says they picked him up dead. But when Paul went to him, Paul said life is still in him, which leaves some ambiguity. Did he actually die and Paul raised him from the dead? Or was he not dead in the first place? But people just simply assumed that even Luke could write it that way, that he died. And in Acts chapter 14, the Jewish enemies of Paul stoned him. And they left him for dead, but soon after they left, he got up and walked away. So people at the time, they took the first signs of lack of movement to mean that a person died. And so this became widespread about Jesus. But there is an underlying text, like there's a subtext that shows that that really there was some ambiguity, and some of them knew that there is this kind of an ambiguity. For example, when in Acts of the Apostles, Peter gets up to speak, he cites Psalm 16, which really is about a person who came close to death but didn't die. They cite very often Psalm 118 to say that Jesus was the cornerstone that was rejected, but he became the capstone. Psalm in verse number 17 says very clearly, I will not die. So it's not talking about a person who dies. Psalm 70 is quoted at the crucifixion scene with people saying, aha, and they're wagging their heads. That too is about a person who doesn't actually die. So the subtext is there that Jesus didn't actually die.
Dr. Tony?
Yeah, I think that when we want to go back as historians, the only thing we have to reconstruct the past is texts and eyewitness texts. This is not like the scientific method where we can observe things. Now, if we go back to the earliest sources of Christianity, once again, there's a consistent stream. There's a consistent message, and that is that Jesus Christ died for our sins, he was buried, was raised, he appeared. Jesus even instituted a meal before his death. He instituted a meal called the Last Supper. We call it the Eucharist, where he took bread and took the cup, and he said, this is my body, this is my blood, which is to be shed for you for the remission of sins. The church has been celebrating this meal ever since the beginning of Christianity. And what is the point of the meal? To declare the Lord's death, not to declare the Lord's swooning or apparent death, but the Lord's death until he comes. Now, the questioner makes a very good point. The early disciples of the apostles, we call them the apostolic fathers, like Ignatius and Polycarp and Clement, all of these with a unanimous voice say Jesus Christ died for us, Jesus Christ was buried, and Jesus Christ was raised. Even the heretics like Celsus, that Origen in his writing speaks of Celsus, who mocked the crucifixion of Jesus, that you guys worship this crucified sage who is an imposter and so forth. And we look at this consistent stream of testimony. Now, even the passages that Shabir quoted, Psalm 16:10, Peter is quoting that in Jerusalem, talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and says the tomb of David, our father, is still with us to this day. And his whole point is to show that the tomb of Jesus is actually empty. And Psalm 16 is pointing to the fact that God would not allow his Holy One to see corruption, and he would not abandon the soul of his Holy One to Sheol. The only way you get to Sheol is if you die. You don't get to Sheol while you're still alive. And so I think it's very clear that we have a consistent stream. So the onus, the burden of proof is on Shabir to show us otherwise. And I don't think his case has been convincing at all tonight.
All right. Hey, Dr. Shabir, these questions are heavy, man. So there's a lot of questions for you, man. So it's tough, man. Sorry about that.
I'll drink some water and be ready here.
Ready? All right. Shabir, why are the Jews saying that they killed their Messiah in Surah 4:157? If the Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and neither did they kill him, the Romans did.
So the text is a little bit blurry from my end. So do you mind reading it one more time? Because I think I missed a part of what you read there.
Yeah, I can. Shabir, why are the Jews saying that they killed their Messiah in Surah 4:157? If the Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and neither did they kill him, the Romans did.
Okay, so Ian Mevorach wrote an article about this, and I believe it is a Journal of Religion and Society, in which he, as a Christian, is trying to appreciate what the Quran is talking about here. And he has the idea that the Quran is referring to and rebutting what is mentioned in the Talmud, where they say that they crucified, they hung Jesus on the eve of Passover for his practice of magic and being a false prophet. So from the Jewish conceptualization, the person is stoned to death and then hung as a spectacle. According to Mevarak, the Quran is saying, well, they are boasting that they did this. This is the Talmud, and they're just repeating what the Talmud says, and they're claiming responsibility for that. Whereas, in fact, yes, we know that it's not the Jews who actually killed Jesus, according to the Gospels, but the Romans are the ones who are responsible. And why would the Jews say that they killed the Messiah? Why would they call him Messiah and still kill him? Well, this is in their mocking of Jesus. They're saying satirically that the guy who claimed to be the Messiah, we killed him, so we killed the Messiah. Notice that in the same vein, they said that they called him messenger of God. So the question could be asked, why would they call him messenger of God and still boast that they killed him? Who want to say that we killed the messenger of God? Nobody. But they mean the one who claimed to be a messenger of God, we know to be a false messenger, and we killed him for the very reason.
All right, Dr. Tony.
Yeah, the Talmud, the reference in the Talmud, this comes from the Babylonian Talmud. The quote is from Sanhedrin 43a. Now, in the Talmud itself, it doesn't claim that Jesus is the Messiah at all. It simply says that he is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come. And then it says that they hanged him on the eve of Passover. There's nothing said here in boast that they believe that they were killing the Messiah and any of that. Surah 4, verse 157, and I'm sure Shabir has already corroborated this before, there's only 40 words in the Arabic text, and it's a very ambiguous text. There's various views on this text. Shabir, the Ahmadiyya movement, takes it to mean that Jesus didn't really die, he swooned. There are other Muslims and other Islamic traditions that would say, no, Jesus really died on the cross. And then there are those who say, no way, no how, he wasn't crucified, he didn't die. And so, but then there are other parts in the Quran that says he is going to die. God is going to cause him to die, and so forth. And that blessed is, peace be on me, the day I die, the day I shall be raised, and so forth. And so there is no claim in the Talmud that the Jews are saying, this guy Yeshua, he claimed to be the Messiah, but we showed him. There's none of that. I think what the Quran is addressing is probably things that Muhammad would have heard. Surah 4:156 says, and for the calumny that they raised against the mother of Jesus as well. And I think when he was in Medina, he probably heard a lot of nasty stuff from the Jewish people there. And I think that's how it came into the Quranic text.
All right. And here's another question for you, Shabir. Can you provide at least 4 different verses and context proving the idea of a contradicting resurrection story of Assumption? One from each gospel will be great.
There's a whole book written about this, and it's not that you have, specific texts, but I can refer you to the books. Here's the one book that I mentioned to you, Revisiting the Empty Tomb by Daniel Smith. I hope you can see that. And there are other books as well. I mean, Daniel Smith is only one such scholar. There is another book by Bernard Brandon Scott entitled The Trouble with Resurrection. Bernard Brandon Scott. So what the scholars are saying is that while there is no direct text in the New Testament saying, okay, Jesus assumed into heaven, as opposed to the resurrection paradigm, we can see that there are hints that something else is at work. So, for example, the idea that Jesus might have ascended from the cross. We know in Luke's gospel that he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Well, this is very close to what is mentioned in the gospel of Peter. And in the gospel of Peter, it is more clear. And scholars conclude that this is a good evidence of a belief that Jesus actually ascended from the cross. Of course, he would have ascended in spirit from the cross. In John's gospel, the crucifixion is actually synonymous with Jesus being raised up. So John is speaking about Jesus being put on the cross as if this is like a first stage towards going higher. He's going up into heaven. He's going up towards heaven by going on the cross. And you find this something like 12 times the expression is used in John's Gospel. So the underlying assumption is there that that there is the paradigm of assumption is something that is being overlaid by the paradigm of resurrection. All of the writings are trying to say that resurrection is the thing. Jesus died, he came back to life, and then subsequently at some later time, he was raised up into heaven. But the assumption paradigm takes out that middle term that says that Jesus met and dwelt with his disciples and ate with them, and it only has the crucifixion scene followed by the raising up into heaven. That is the assumption paradigm, and this is there in the underlying text that has been covered up by the overlay of the resurrection paradigm.
All right, Dr. Tony.
Yeah, that just sounds so strained that there's somehow this covert work going on in the New Testament. They're trying to cover this early strata of this assumption narrative. It just is so strained and ad hoc to me. The understanding of assumption was known to the Jews, and as Shabir said, assumption does mean, I have an idea. The assumption was the idea that God could take people from one dimension, an earthly dimension, and move them into a heavenly dimension. Now we do see that with Enoch, we do see that with Elijah. But it's very clear that that's an assumption or a translation. But the language that is used of Jesus is not that of an assumption, it's that of a resurrection. And then later that of an ascension. And so in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus gives his spirit to the Father, this is what happens at death. We give up the ghost, we give up the spirit. But certainly if that was some special assumption of Jesus, then every dead person has been assumed. Every person in the world should be special, because when they die, they expire and they give their spirit to God as well. So then that would make everyone, I guess, on par with Jesus. But that's not what's going on. Obviously, resurrection applies to the body. So the Greek word anastasis is a reference to the return of the body from death. And every Jew understood this, that resurrection meant you were dead and now your body's been raised to life. And so the apostles could have used the language of the writers of the New Testament could have used that. That language is available in Second Temple Judaism, but they don't. They use the language of anastasis, and then they use the less language of ascension into heaven. So again, the burden of proof is on those who would try to argue otherwise than what the text clearly states.
All right, and here's another question. They heavy you, Dr. Shabir. I'm sorry, man.
So I'll do my best.
All right.
It's getting to Canada Day, so let's be happy and make everyone happy here.
All right. Why would God make it look like Jesus died, knowing the result would be Christianity? Was that law not powerful enough to prevent Christianity and protect Jesus' true message?
Well, we didn't get into the theological matters much, except in my cross-examination of Tony. But the Quran's concern is not the details of how Jesus left this world, though the Quran makes some passing reference to it. That's not the core issue. If Jesus died and resurrected from the dead and he was raised up by God in an ascension later on, after he had met and dwelt with his disciples and so on, that does not go against Muslim theology. What goes against Muslim theology is to say that Jesus died for the sins of humankind, or that Jesus died as a ransom for as a sacrifice to the Father. All of this is contrary to Muslim theology. So the Quran is trying to correct the theology, never mind the details of the crucifixion. Now, a lot of what has been discussed so far, and in Tony's answers, to his counter answers, we can say, Tony is assuming that what we have in the New Testament, this is the fact. And when the New Testament says that the disciples said this or preached this, that is what the disciples actually said and preached. But everyone knows now in modern scholarship, this is not acceptable. For example, in the introduction to the New Jerusalem Bible's book of Acts, they say quite clearly that the speeches and Acts are actually composed by the writer of Acts. These are not exact words of Peter. We do not have the original writings of the original disciples of Jesus. 2 letters are said to be from Peter, but 2 Peter is notoriously regarded to be fictitiously ascribed to Peter, according to Richard Bauckham, a conservative scholar. So we cannot assume that what the New Testament says that the disciples said is actually what the disciples said. So saying that Jesus came and he dwelt with the disciples and so on, and therefore we must have it that what the disciples concluded from all of this is the correct faith, assumes that we have the faith of the disciples actually written in the New Testament, and that is a huge assumption, and it is not corroborated by history. Rather, the contrary. We can see that what we have in the New Testament is largely a Pauline theology, and this can hardly be credited to the original disciples of Jesus. For example, the idea that Jesus died for our sins. This is not in Judaism. It's actually contrary to the Old Testament to say that the Father crucified his Son in order to appease his own anger.
Dr. Tony?
Yeah, I think the questioner, the question that was being asked is a very good one, and that is that the Quran says that it appeared so unto them. It appeared as if Jesus actually died, which sounds a lot like the Gnostic material at the time that said that uses the same language in Greek, that it looked like Jesus died, but it wasn't really Jesus. But it does create a sense of deception on the part of Allah, because when you look at the fact that the earliest followers of Jesus, which the Quran actually says will be victorious until the day of judgment, that Allah will give them victory. And the only form of Christianity that seems to have won the day and even brought the Roman Empire down was a Christianity that affirmed the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, even up until today. And so the sense is almost as if that Allah caused the followers of Jesus to think he was raised from the dead, that he died and was raised from the dead, because clearly that's what all of these early documents tell us. Now Shabir did commit a serious error there when he said that this idea of atonement, dying on behalf of others, is not a Jewish idea. That is not true at all. In Rabbinic Judaism, there is the doctrine of the death of the righteous makes atonement. The death of the righteous people makes atonement for the generation. And there are cases in Second Temple Jewish literature. If you look at Fourth Maccabees, for example, it talks about the death of the martyrs, the Jewish martyrs, that God would accept it as an atonement for the people of Israel. And you also find this as well in Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls, where among the community rule was the idea that the leaders of the Qumran community would make atonement on behalf of Israel with their righteous living and so forth, and including death as well. So it is ask any Orthodox rabbi who's well studied in the Talmud, and they will tell you the death of the righteous makes atonement. If you guys are interested in this, you could look up my article. It's online, The Concept of Atoning Death in the New Testament, Pagan or Jewish. It's available online. If you punch that title in with my name, you'll be able to find it. And Professor Irving Zeitlin, who I studied under at the University of Toronto, even went so far as to say, and he was a Jewish scholar, he said Paul's conception of Jesus as a sacrificial lamb, 1 Corinthians 5:7, whose death was expiatory, is distinctly Jewish. In all these respects, Paul has always remained firmly rooted in Judaism. So that's coming from a Jewish professor, not a Christian.
All right. And a couple more questions, and then we'll shut this thing down. And another question for you, Dr. Shabir. If you think that it's possible that God healed Christ after the crucifixion and brought him out of the tomb, isn't it possible Christ died and God resurrected him?
Yeah, I'm not denying that as a possibility in the realm of possibilities. But for us to claim that's a huge claim. We have to have good evidence for that. And the evidence which Tony has presented, I don't believe is a good evidence. One of his strong pieces of evidence is that Jesus came and dwelt with his disciples. Because when Tony is saying, look, here's one of my pieces of fact that Jesus appeared. Notice that when he cited the scholars, when I asked him, he quoted Paul of Fredrickson, and he quoted another scholar whose name escapes me at the moment. But these scholars are not saying that the gospel narratives are true. They're saying that something appeared, like they had some experience of seeing Jesus. and not that they had this experience of feeling and touching and dining with him. So with that experience of seeing Jesus, that could be credited, according to these scholars, to hallucination. Maybe they're seeing what they want to see. Maybe Peter was guilty, feeling guilty that he denied his master. He went back fishing, and on one of his fishing trips, it seemed to him as if Jesus was there on the water. He started to see this vision. He told others told others, and somebody says, that's why I saw something like that too. So one tells the other, people start saying that they saw the vision as well. It gets to be multiplied until Paul can say that he appeared to 500 at once. But that's an evolutionary dead end, because nobody else mentions the 500. In Acts of the Apostles, you can see that the whole scenario does not give the feel that people know that Jesus is resurrected from the dead. It's always like the disciples are trying to proclaim it, but there are people, for example, the Sadducees, who still do not believe in the resurrection of the dead. And Paul, writing to the Corinthians, there are still Corinthians who do not believe that the dead get resurrected. So, which means by conclusion that they don't believe that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead. And Paul is now trying to prove to them all over again. But his proof is only to say that, there are people. But he doesn't name the people. He doesn't say, for example, go check with Ananias on Main Street. He's one of the persons that Jesus talked to. So the idea that Jesus was, resurrected from the dead requires good evidence. And even the idea that Jesus was assumed from the tomb, requires evidence. Otherwise, history would just say the guy died, he was in the tomb, that's the end of it. You Muslims and Christians are all believing in theology. You have a Christ of faith, whereas we are talking about the Jesus of history. From the historian's point of view, Jesus is dead, that's the end of it. But Muslims are asserting a miracle here, that God raised Jesus from the tomb. Christians are asserting a miracle that Jesus came out of the tomb, lived and walked with his disciples, ate food, and then eventually was raised up to heaven 40 days later on. So the Christians are asserting a bigger miracle. That requires more proof. Muslims do not even need to assert that the physical body of Jesus left the tomb. Muslims can believe that maybe Jesus was assumed as a spirit into heaven. Maybe his body was left in the tomb. So there are different possibilities of Muslim belief, as Tony himself has alluded to in reference to the Quranic verse, Surah 4, verse 157 to 58.
All right, Dr. Tony?
Yeah, I mean, an assumed spirit, while the body is still in the tomb, would again bring us back to, there's nothing unique here. I mean, when people die, their bodies stay behind and their spirits leave their body. So what happened to Jesus happens to everybody every day. Every time there's a death in the world, even now as people are dying, they're being assumed. But once again, that doesn't explain the multiple attestation that we find to the empty tomb. If there's a body in the tomb, you don't talk about a tomb being empty. And you wouldn't need guards to bribe the religious leaders to bribe the guards into saying that the disciples stole the body in the night. There was no body in that tomb. That's the problem. And Ludemann and Fredrickson, the two scholars I mentioned about postmortem appearances, where did they get the idea that the disciples saw something? I mean, where did they get this? What is their basis for making that claim? The New Testament texts, not just the Gospels, but the testimony of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. It's from the multiple attestation in the Gospels and in the letter of Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, that leads Fredrickson and Ludemann to say that they saw something according to the sources. Now, would they agree that it happened exactly in the way that it's said? No, I wouldn't grant that they make that claim. But I would say it's the New Testament texts themselves that have convinced them. Now, the whole hallucination theory collapses when you think of the fact that, look, I can grant a hallucination theory. One person thinks they see Jesus. I can grant that. But appearing to groups of people, 500 people, I mean, Jesus must have been a great hypnotist to hypnotize a whole bunch of people at the same time. But in order for you to be hypnotized, you need a hypnotizer to be there, a veridical person to be there to hypnotize you. And so the whole idea, I mean, the fact that these disciples were willing to stake everything on that claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and that according to the New Testament, some of them met some very awful deaths. And later on, church tradition tells us the way the other apostles died. There is no way these guys would have made this thing up and then died with the confession that Jesus was Lord and that Jesus was risen from the dead. So once again, I think the arguments Shabir is presenting don't have enough explanatory power to explain the origins of Christianity.
All right. Here's another question here. Thank you for the question. Question for Shabir. The Jews say Jesus died. The Romans says Jesus died. The Christians say Jesus died. Why shouldn't we trust all these witnesses?
As I explained before, Marlon, the people at the time naturally assumed that Jesus died, and I must grant that as you know, if we're looking at this from a historical point of view, a person who used to live 2,000 years ago and is no longer here, he must be dead. That's a simple conclusion. So the Romans and the others, what are they going to say? They're not going to say that Jesus is still alive in heaven. They're going to say that Jesus died. That's a simple conclusion. The simple Christians at the time also drawing the conclusion very quickly that a person died. This is what they could say. But if we could go back and say, okay, so they said that he died, and then they said he was still up and about. So we want to go back to the incident where they said he died. We want to examine, like, what would have proved his death at that time? Is it a simple assumption? And in my cross-examination with Tony, I actually showed that, it just came to light that Tony does not have any clear indication that Jesus was determined to be dead according to proper historical standards. They were just there on the foot of the cross. They look at Jesus and they say he died. Tony says, well, they must have seen the discoloration of his body, but the discoloration of his body to indicate death would not come so soon. In fact, this is one of the reasons why we see in the Gospel according to Matthew that they said that Matthew says that the women came to see the tomb because the Babylonian Talmud says that 3 days after a person is buried, you should go have a look at the tomb to make sure that the person is dead, because it happened, in fact, according to the Babylonian Talmud, that a young man was presumed dead. He was buried. And 3 days later, he was found to be still alive, and he went on to have children. So it was possible that people at the time, the best they could do, they didn't have morgues to keep a person. Person appeared to be dead. They presumed he's dead. They didn't have ECG and EEG equipment to measure for brain waves or heart activity. They presumed that the person was died, but they waited and watched. Maybe the person is still alive. And Tony is saying, but they put the guards. But of course, this is all said by modern scholars to be later legend. It's not actually factual.
All right, Dr. Tony.
Yeah, I think there's a very important point that has not been mentioned yet, and that is what scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. Now, if the disciples could have Jesus just survive crucifixion and be assumed into heaven, that would probably have made their case a lot easier. What made their case so difficult was the belief that the Messiah was a crucified criminal. He was treated as a crucified criminal. And to preach a crucified Messiah was basically an oxymoron. It's like shooting yourself in the foot. Because according to Deuteronomy 21:23, whoever hangs on a tree is cursed by God. And you can understand why even Jews today make that claim. Why should we believe Jesus is the Messiah? Look at the way he died. It would have been counterintuitive. In fact, it was counterintuitive to the preaching of Jesus dead and raised to the Jews. Even Paul calls the preaching of the cross as a stumbling block to the Jews, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. So think about it. Which of the two alternatives would the disciples have had more success with? If they preached that Jesus was put on the cross, but he actually didn't die, but he was assumed into heaven, that would be a much easier message than to proclaim that Jesus actually was killed as a criminal, hung on a cross, which they identified as being hung on a tree, and then raised from the dead. And so why would they do that unless that's what happened? And so the criterion of embarrassment plays a very major role here, that it is so against the Jewish thinking that the Messiah, the King of Israel, the anointed one, would die the death of a common criminal. That's what made preaching to the Jews such a difficult task for the early Christians. And if they could have made it easier, I mean, think about it, why not? But they didn't, because that is what happened. That's exactly what happened. And that's why they preached that. And that's why they went to their deaths believing that.
All right. And here's our final question of the night. Thank you for the question. Ali, can you name 5 witnesses in the time of Jesus who saw this crucifixion?
I'm not sure if the questioner expressed the question in the right way, because obviously nobody is denying that they were witnesses at the time who saw the crucifixion. But I want to say something about Tony's assertion that the disciples of Jesus died for what they saw and what they believed. Sean Anthony, who has written his doctoral dissertation on the subject, and it's published, and recently he wrote an article in the book collected by Michael Lacona and Beck. So in that article, Sean Anthony summarizes his findings, and he admits that we cannot show that the disciples actually died for for this belief. And even what he argues is actually quite faulty, because he says, let's prove that the disciples believe in a resurrection faith, and then let's prove that some of them were persecuted for their beliefs. So now, he's trying to mesh the two. But one has to be more specific than this. First of all, which of the disciples actually died by martyrdom? We only know about Peter. We know possibly about James. But then James was not one of the 12. And, James, son of Zebedee, is one of the 12. He died early, but his brother John survived, according to Christian tradition, into old age so he could write a gospel. Christians say that Matthew wrote Matthew. Well, this Matthew wasn't killed for his faith. Others who were there on the scene, like Matthias and so on, how did he die? How did Bartholomew and Andrew and Thomas die? All of this, one can cite legends to say how they died, but one cannot actually prove historically that these number of people actually died by preaching the crucifixion. And moreover, when we see the conflicts that are there in Acts of the Apostles, often it was not a conflict about crucifixion and about Jesus resurrecting from the dead. It was a conflict over law, about the desecration of the temple. Paul, on one occasion, said that he is under trial because he preaches the resurrection from the dead. But that wasn't actually factual, because they were actually questioning not the resurrection from the dead, but they were questioning his, allegiance to the law and his supposed desecration of the temple. So it is actually quite fictitious when Christian apologists are claiming that the disciples died because they believed in the resurrection of Jesus. Some of them died, but they could have died for other causes. For example, if Rome thought that these are followers of the same guy that we crucified for treason. So these are followers of the person who committed treason, and probably they're committing treason as well by going against Rome. So there's so many different reasons, and it's a complex situation. Christian apologists just put it simply and incorrectly.
Dr. Tony?
Yeah, in terms of the witnesses in the time of Jesus who saw the crucifixion, John, the beloved disciple, claims to be a witness. In fact, when you read John's Gospel, the 19th chapter, when they pierced the side of Jesus and the water and the blood came out, John says, hey, I testify, I, the one whom writing this, I testify that this is true, and the one who saw it bears witness. The guy is so desperately trying to tell you, look, this is real, this is what I saw. I think John was a witness to the crucifixion event. I think Peter, we're told that Peter followed at a distance. I think Peter would have been a reliable witness as well. I also think that Simon of Cyrene, there's good evidence within the Gospel of Mark to suggest that Simon of Cyrene did become a Christian, because Mark refers to him as the father of Rufus, and there's another son that he's mentioned. And Mark mentions this as if the readers of Mark know who this person is, which would highly probably argue that he was a member of Mark's Christian community. So I think Simeon of Cyrene was there. He was a witness to this event as well. And of course, many of the others, Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple of Jesus. He would have been present at the scene. He later takes it upon himself to do right by Jesus and give him a burial following his death, and then the entombment and so forth. So I think there's good arguments to be made. Crucifixion was a very public event. Raymond Brown points out in his book, Death of the Messiah, that the crucifixion of Jesus was the most public event of his life, because it was done where you had masses of people, thoroughfares of masses of people going by, and it was done deliberately by Rome to say, you mess with us, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be hung up on a cross like all of these here. So the witnesses to this event, I think, is unquestionable.
All right. Good stuff, guys. I appreciate both of you for coming on and debating this great topic and add to some more of the nice catalog content of the Gospel Truth, man. You guys have any closing words before I close this thing out?
Sure.
Do you want to go first, Shabir? I was just going to say, I just want to thank you, Marlon, for bringing myself and Shabir on. As I said, I've known Shabir for 30 years, and I think this is probably our 12th or 13th interaction, Shabir. I think we're going to do this until we're ready to go into the grave. But I just want to say I had a wonderful time, and I think that thank you, Marlon, for being a great moderator, being respectful as well, and Shabir as well. And I think that I hope that our viewers can see that, you know what, we can get along, we can talk about these things in a loving way. And as Christians, we are called to respect our fellow man. We are image bearers of God. We are children of Adam, and we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so to share our questions with one another. We all don't have the answers to everything. Only God is omniscient, knows all things. But I hope that this is an example of what dialogue should look like between people of different faith traditions.
Shabir?
Yeah, likewise, Marlon, I would like to say thank you for inviting me to this platform to have this dialogue. Thank you, Tony, for agreeing to share this platform with me. And my thanks to all of our viewers and followers out there who have been paying attention and asking questions. That keeps us all alive and alert, and I'm happy for that. I'm glad that our dialogue proceeded in such a cordial fashion, and I appreciate Tony's humble words at the end. Yes, we don't know everything. The Quran itself tells us that we are to invite people with wisdom and good preaching. And if we happen to argue, it should be in a way that is most gracious. And in fact, when it comes to dealing with Christians, the Quran specifically says that Christians are closest to the Muslim believers in terms of love. And we have a lot in common. So the Quran says, let us invite them to that which is a common word between us and them. And in the end, our theological differences will be settled by God in the life hereafter. We cannot settle them all in this life, but let us compete with each other in doing good things. And compete is not the only way. We can work in collaboration with each other to bring about a great amount of good in the world. And our theological differences should be understood, but not be posed as a hindrance to our collective and collaborative effort for the good of all humankind.
All right, guys. Thank you so much once again. I look forward to maybe doing this again sometime. So at this time, I'll be letting you guys go. I appreciate you guys, and I'll be reaching out to you once again. I'm sure I will. You guys take care, and God bless. All right?
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, everybody. God bless. Bye.
Right.
Bye-bye.
All right, another great show in the books, man. And this is what I like, man. Conversations like this where two individuals who obviously theologically disagree can actually have a conversation that's worthwhile. A lot of times, sometimes it gets difficult. Sometimes it gets hard to have these conversations with those who disagree with you. And I think not only should we be taking in the idea of learning these different theological positions, but we should also learn from behavior, right? We're watching these guys debate. They clearly disagree. They clearly don't agree, but the behavior patterns or the way they go about disagreeing is what we should also be paying attention to. And I think that's important. I do want to give a shout out to Mr. Rod. I think I said his name right. Rod. Yeah, Rob. Cat 82, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate you. He says Tony Costa explaining logically and teaching truth. All right, man. Yeah, I think they both did a great job. I think they both really explained their positions very well. and express their understanding very well. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much for that super chat, man. And you know, I do want to make sure that you guys understand you can also become a patron. You know, super chats is not the only way that you guys can support the ministry. You can become a patron of the Gospel Truth so that you can support the ministry on a monthly basis. You know, why not? All right. I do plan on doing great things with the finances. Plan on extending the ministry a little bit further than what we're at on the YouTube. I do want to hit the streets. I do want to do conferences. So those are all some of the plans and ideas that I have working in the plan with the Gospel Truth, man. So it's all about God's glory and how He wants to take this ministry, what He wants to do with it. With that said, I'm going to get out of here. I appreciate everyone for joining me tonight on the Gospel Truth. I appreciate everyone for supporting the ministry, asking questions, doing what you do, as you always do. You're here every night supporting the ministry, and I thank you for all my patrons who are patrons with the Gospel Truth. I thank you as well for your support. That said, I'm going to get out of here. I thank everyone for supporting in and watching tonight, and be on the lookout for the next show that's coming up here in the future. I think it's Robert Rowe and Jay Cox. They'll be debating some global, the Earth completely flood or a flood Earth debate, or local flood or global flood debate, I believe it is. So anyway, be on the lookout for that. May God bless you and may God keep you. Gone.